So Cubase 13 has been out just a couple of days at the point of shooting this video, so I figured this would be the perfect opportunity to go through my updated mixing template that I'm going to be using for Cubase 13 Pro. Now the great thing about this is it doesn't matter which DAW you're using. You might be using an older version of Cubase, maybe you're using Logic, Pro Tools, Ableton. It doesn't matter, you can still use this exact same template. Now you might decide to copy this exactly, or you might tweak it and adjust it to suit your own needs. But either way, this template is going to be an excellent starting point for any mix you do, whether it's pop, rock, country, metal, EDM. This mix template has got you covered. So let's dive in and take a look. So there are 3 parts to my mixing template, as you can see, that are color coded on the screen. The first is my mix bus. We then have all of my effects channels here that are in purple, and then we have group tracks at the bottom which are in blue. I'm a huge fan of top-down mixing and processing the mix bus, and in fact I've got a detailed video of exactly how I use mix bus processing on my channel, so you should definitely go and check that out. Now actually this is one part of my template that I've not changed for quite a while now, and for really good reason. It just works. The first thing on my mix bus is the Slate Virtual Console. I love the sound of an SSL 4KE console, particularly the center section. I've got the input here which I can push to get more of that mid-range saturation. There's also the drive control down here, and you can also take the noise off as well. So it's just a really good plugin to add that saturation. Next is the Mixbus compressor. Again, I'm using Slate and it's the FG Red. Again, the Focusrite Red 3 is probably my favorite Mixbus compressor of all time. It does the SSL thing, but I find that it's a bit more forgiving. The SSL can be quite grabby and it can push down on the transients just a little bit too hard, whereas I find the Focusrite gives me everything I like about the SSL, but without any of the grabbiness. I've got the ratio very low, so it's just 1.5 to 1. I also love this drive function. This models the saturation that you get from the output transformer. Normally on the hardware unit, you would have to drive the output gain to get that saturation, but here you don't have to do that, it's on that knob. And usually I'm aiming for somewhere around 3 to 4, maybe 5 dB of gain reduction. It's just a really solid bus compressor. After that, we're going into EQ. Now, with mixed bus compression, sometimes I find that that can suck up a bit too much low end. So this EQ is putting that back, and for me, there is nothing better than a Pultec. I used to have a couple of hardware Pultecs. It was the Warm Audio versions, which were great, but I fell out of love with them, sold them on, and I just couldn't find a great plugin version of the Pultec that I loved until I tried this one. This is the UAD Pultec. It's part of the UAD Spark subscription. It sounds incredible. It sounds better than those Warm Audio units that I used to have. So I'm boosting a little bit of 60 just to add some of that low end that gets taken away from the bus compression. And I'm also adding a high shelf at 5K. It sounds gorgeous on a Pultec. So having that on my mix bus, having all of the tracks going through that, I find just gets me to the end point of the mix much quicker. After that, we're then going into a virtual tape machine. Again, this is from Slate. I love the sound of tape, and this is a really great plugin. I've got it set on the 1/2" 2-track, the FG456 tape type, which I just find does the tape thing a little bit better. And I've also got it set to 15 IPS, again, just for that classic tape sound. What you do tend to find, though, with 15 IPS is that you get a low boost. But on this plugin, you have the ability to realign that bass. So I've got that knocked down to about 3 dB, just to reduce that bass boost that you typically get from tape. And also you've got the noise on the fader here, so noise is all the way down, because why does anyone want any noise? The final thing on my mix bus is just Pro L2. This is just a limiter. I typically will put this on when I'm getting to the end of a mix. This gives me an opportunity to hear what happens to the mix when I push it into a limiter, and if there's anything that I don't like, then I've got the opportunity to do something about it. But before I export it and send it to mastering, then I will obviously disable this. So that's the mix bus. Let's now take a look at the effects that I've got. So my philosophy with FX is that I want a palette of delays and reverbs that I can use for different purposes to create a landscape. Imagine an artist painting a picture. They want all of the different colours, they want all of the different brushes to create that texture, to create that depth and to create a stunning piece of art? Well, I think of mixing in a similar way to that. So these first 5 FX tracks are all delays, and they're all doing something slightly different. Now, all of my delays, I'm using the Repeater plugin by Slate Digital, and the reason for that is because it sounds great, but it's also got a ton of different delays all modeled in one plugin. So it's super versatile, and it can do literally anything you want. So this first one is a classic slap delay. This is set to 166 milliseconds, which is that classic tape slap. And after the delay plugin, I've also got the VTM plugin by Slate. Again, just to make it sound even more like tape. We've got this set to 2" 16 track. We've got it on the 456 tape type. I just love the sound of that tape. And again at 15 IPS, just so it's really doing that tape thing. Next we have an 1/8 note delay. Again, this is using the Repeater plugin, and this is just set to a digital delay on a full 1/8 note. However, as you can see, I'm using the spread function. Now what this does is it creates a slight time delay between the left and the right channels. Now normally what you'd have to do with different delays that don't have this function is you would have to convert the BPM of the song and figure out what an 1/8 note is in milliseconds. You would then minus 5 milliseconds for the left side and then plus 5 seconds for the right side. But this just does that automatically. By turning the spread function on, it's there. It's a massive time saver. Next, we have the throw delay. This is what I will use at key moments of the song. So, for example, if there's a lead vocal passage, but then there's a gap and you might want the vocal to delay in that gap, this is where you would push up the throw delay. This is set to a full note. Depending on the timing, the tempo, you might want it set to a half. And again, I've got the spread function on for this just to give it some extra depth and 3D-ness. You might decide that it sounds better as a mono delay. That's entirely up to you. But this is just for those key moments of the song, just to make the vocal stand out, make it sound that bit more exciting. The next delay we have is a guitar delay. This is what I will typically run guitar solos through. Again, there's a really good preset on Repeater just called Memory Guy. It's a lead guitar preset. And what I've got for this is a 1/8 note in the left and a 1/4 note in the right. Typically what I will do is I will pan lead guitars ever so slightly to one side, usually to the left. By putting a longer delay on the right, that just creates a really nice stereo sort of soundscape for that lead guitar. Your lead guitars are usually just mono tracks, so you can use a delay like this to just make it sound bigger, to push it out and give it some sort of stereo 3D-ness to it. Now the next delay is what I call a crowd delay, and I'm not using Repeater for this. I'm using the Ursa Major Space Station. These units sounded absolutely incredible. They sounded so good, and this plugin by Audiority does a pretty good job. It comes pretty close. Now, what I've got this set to, there's a really good preset on there, which I've tweaked to what I like, called Space Repeats. And what this is like a series of really short, sharp delays. And it creates a sort of crowd-like effect. It's a bit more intense than the slap delay, and it repeats a little bit more. But it just creates a really nice sense of space. It sounds great on vocals, and it sounds great on things like acoustic guitars and pianos and strings, maybe things like pedal steel if you're doing country music. It's just really good at putting things in a space and creating that sort of 3D depth to your mix. Now next we're on to reverbs. The next 6 effects are all reverbs. Again, different reverbs, different sounds, for specific purposes. Let's talk through them. Now for all of my reverbs, I'm using the Verb Suite plugin. Again, this is by Slate Digital. It's part of the All Access Pass for a couple of reasons. Number one, it sounds incredible, which is the most important thing. But Verb Suite, like Repeater with the delays, it has loads of different classic reverb units all just built into it in one plugin. So it's really versatile. It's got anything that you need, whether it's plates, whether it's halls, whether it's rooms, they're all just there in one unit. Now the first one is a plate reverb. This is the Lexicon 480 plate, and this is a classic verb that I will use for vocals. It just sounds really, really good. I've got the decay set to 2 seconds, so it's nice and long, it's lush. But my secret weapon when it comes to vocal delays is the pre-delay. I have this set typically around 150 milliseconds, and the reason that I do this is because it detaches the reverb from the vocal. So you can get that big lush reverb, but without it sounding crowded, without it sounding muddy, and you can still get lots of reverb and lots of depth, but with your vocals still sounding intimate and upfront. If you have the pre-delay set to 0, the reverb comes in at exactly the same time as the vocal. It can all just get a little bit too crowded and muddy very, very quickly. But by pushing the delay away from the vocal, you get the best of both worlds, an intimate upfront vocal, but with a nice big lush reverb just behind it. Just in front of this reverb, I do have a EQ. This is just the Slate SSL. I'm just taking off a little bit of 10k. The worst thing about vocal reverbs is when you get sibilance echoing in the reverbs. So I'm ducking 10k out a little bit. I'm boosting a little bit of 300 just for some more body, and then taking out a bit of 70 just for that low rumble that we just don't need. And again, this just allows me to quickly shape the reverb if I need to in the mix. The next reverb is a room. This is modeling an old Sony 2000 reverb unit. Now I'll typically use this on drums, so I've got the decay set fairly short, about 600 milliseconds, and I'm typically sending things like drum rooms and snare samples to it to make them sound bigger. So I want a short decay time to hear that initial burst of reverb, but then I want it to get out of the way. I don't want it to be lingering on and crowding and muddying the mix. One thing I do have before this though, again, is an EQ, and I'm boosting a ton of highs on this. As you can see, I've got a shelf set at 1k, and I'm boosting like 12 dB. This is a bright sounding room, and it sounds incredible on drums. It sounds so good. It can lift drums, it can elevate them, and just give them some extra brightness and size. Sometimes I'll use it on vocals, sometimes it can be a bit too bright, so it depends on the mix. The next reverb is a Bricasti reverb, and this is the marble room setting. I just love the sound of this verb, and it sounds great on drums, it sounds great on instruments like pianos, strings, acoustic guitars. But typically if the Sony room is too bright, I tend to find that this is a really good alternative. Again, it's a bright sounding reverb, but it's a different sound to the Sony. The next one is a percussion plate. This is modelled off an old 224 plate. This is what I'm typically sending tambourines to. Again, it just sounds really, really good. If you've got those single tambourine hits that you just want to reverberate and you just want them to sound big, larger than life, this sounds awesome. The next reverb is a hall. This is modelled off a H3000 reverb. Again, it's just a different sound. All of the others are rooms and plates. This hall just gives a different sort of vibe. It can sound good on drums if you've got a mix that's not so dense. It's a very lush sounding reverb, this, and sometimes I tend to find if you put drums to it, the drums can just get a little bit muddy and unfocused. But it sounds great on strings, it sounds great on guitars, particularly lead guitars and solos, and it can sound good on acoustic guitars and pianos as well. And the last reverb is this non-linear reverb. This is modelled off the RMX 16 unit, which is a classic reverb unit, and this is that textbook gated reverb sound. So again, I'm typically sending drum rooms and snare samples to this, and it's that non-linear gated sound. So you get that huge rush of reverb when the snare hits, but then it cuts out and it gets out of the way. It's just a really good way to make your drums sound bigger and more exciting. So now we've been through the FX, let's take a look at the group tracks that I'm routing some of my mix through. The first one is drums. All of my drums will just go through this, and there is absolutely nothing on this group track. Nothing at all. This is just a fader for the drums. So everything, kick, snare, overheads, rooms, toms, hat, even things like percussion, shakers, tambourines, all go routed through this. So if I need to bring the drums up or drop the drums down, they're there on one fader. Rather than having to fumble my way through 15, 20 faders, they're all just here on one. The next group is what I call the crusher. Again, this is for the drums, and all of the drums are going through this. Maybe not percussion, I might leave tambourines and shakers out of this, but all of your typical drum tracks, your kicks, your snares, your overheads, your rooms, all that kind of stuff will come through this. This is my parallel processing for the drums, and I've got quite a bit going on. So the first is some EQ and Transient Designer. These plugins are by Slate Digital, the part of the All Access Pass, and the FG Bomber is a Transient Designer. We've got it set to tight, and I've got the drive set so that we're going into the red. What that does is it sharpens up the transients, and it also gives us some really nice sustain on things like the snare, reverb tails, and the rooms and the overheads, which sounds good. Got a little bit of top, a little bit of bottom, just creating a bit of that sort of concave EQ curve for a little bit of excitement. And then we're going into some compression. I'm using an SSL style compressor. This is the FG Grey, 4:1 ratio. And I'm smashing the hell out of this, somewhere around 10 dB of gain reduction. What this does is it creates a really heavily processed, over-compressed, pumping drum sound, which you can blend in, so you can just bring this fader up underneath the normal drums, just to add some excitement, and it can just make the drums pop out of the speakers. The snare and the kick become more pointy and more defined, and the rooms get bigger and the reverb tails get bigger and more exciting as well. It's a really, really awesome track, this. The next one is my guitar group. All of my guitars come through this. Again, the benefit of doing this is that all of the guitars are on one fader. If I want the guitars to come up in the chorus or in the bridge section, rather than going through potentially 20, 30 tracks of guitars and having to automate them up one by one, they're all just here on one fader. You can bring it up, you can bring it down as you need. Now, I do have an EQ on this. This is by Sound Toys, and it's the CQ, it's the Siemens model EQ. I just love the sound of this. It adds some nice grit and texture to guitars. We're adding some lows around 2 to 3 dB, and we're also adding some highs around 2 to 3 dB as well. And it's also got this drive function just for a little bit more saturation and grit. Sounds really, really good. Now, the next two group tracks are both for vocals. This one here is what I call the Dolby bus, and in the rack at the side of me I've got a pair of vintage Dolby A360s. These are my secret weapon when it comes to vocals. I'm routing my vocal doubles, all of the harmonies and all of the backing vocals through these Dolbys. And what they do, they act a bit like an exciter. It adds high frequencies, not like an EQ, it is more like an exciter. It makes the vocals sound incredible. They sound bright, they sound exciting, they sound up front, and they just sound really, really polished. The next group is my vocals. I will typically put all of my vocals through this except the lead vocal. So all of the doubles will go through it, all of the harmonies, all of the backing vocals will go through this track. The benefit again is that all of your vocals are on one fader, so you get to the chorus, you want your vocals to sound bigger, thicker, you want them to come up, everything's just on one fader. You need to bring them down, you can do that very, very easily. Having these group tracks as well is super useful for mix revisions. You might send a mix out to a client, they might say, absolutely love it, but can we bring the vocals down in the chorus? Can we bring the guitars up, the drums up? Well, everything's just here on one track. It's super quick to be able to do that, get that revision back over to them. I do have some processing on this channel though, and the main thing is this Microshift plugin by Sound Toys. I like how this adds thickness to stereo vocals. So typically my doubles, all of my harmonies, BVs will be tracked in pairs, one left and one right, and this can just make them sound bigger, wider and thicker. I've got it set onto this stereo BGV thickener, and I just love the way that it sounds. The mix is set to about 50%. Sometimes I might change this to a different style, to a different preset, but 9 times out of 10 this sounds really, really good. Now, I also do have another plugin before that. However, it is always disabled by default. I'll only turn this on if I feel like the vocals need more brightness, but usually with the Dolbys, I'm getting all of the brightness and excitement that I need. This plugin is just the FG Mu from Slate. It's part of the virtual bus compressors. It's got a really great sound. It's got that sort of Fairchild vibe going on, which sounds really good on vocals. However, it does have a distinct EQ curve to it. It's very, very bright. So if the mix calls for that, then sometimes I'll put it on. But to be honest, since I've been using the Dolbys, I've found that there hasn't really been a need for this plugin. So that's why it's bypassed by default. Now at this point, I want to share something with you that you are almost certainly going to find useful, particularly if you are a songwriter, you're writing songs, releasing music in any way, shape or form. As a songwriter, you probably find that you don't lack ideas. In fact, probably quite the opposite. You've got a million song ideas all floating around your head, or maybe even hummed into the voice notes app on your phone. The problem with this is that it is really easy to forget, or even worse, lose a great song idea forever. The voice notes app on your phone isn't a great organisational tool. As you add more ideas, your older ones get pushed further and further down the list, potentially being forgotten about forever. Or even worse, you upgrade to a new phone and you lose everything. How many great song ideas have gone to waste because of this? Well, I've come up with a solution to this problem, and it's called the Songwriters Project Organiser. This is a tool that you can use on any device, phone, laptop, tablet, anywhere you are. There is a website that you can log into if you're on laptop, or there is a fully featured, super intuitive app if you're on mobile or a tablet. With the Songwriters Project Organiser, you can keep track of every single song idea, no matter what stage of the process it's at. So maybe you've just got a simple hook or idea or a melody. You can put these into one list on the Project Organiser where you've got all your hooks and melodies in one place. You can then have other lists for other songs that are at different stages. So maybe you have a list for songs that are fully written, a list for ones that you've got a demo for, a list for ones that are currently in production, mixing, mastering, and then a list for songs that are finished and they're released. And you might even have a list for songs that you're just not going to work on now. You're just going to shelve them for this moment in time. But the main point is, all of your song ideas are in one place. You can see exactly where they are at in the process, and you will never ever lose access to them. If you get a new phone, not a problem. You just log back into the app or onto the website. Everything is exactly where you left it. Another great feature of this organiser, and probably my favourite, is that it's collaborative. You can share your project organiser with anybody that you choose. So maybe you're collaborating with another artist, maybe you're working with a producer or a mix engineer on a bunch of songs. You can share your organiser with them and they can add their contributions to it in real time as they complete those tasks. You will get updates and everyone can see where the project is at. And you can even attach files and also include web links so that everything is accessible to anyone who needs it, whether that's artwork, whether that's tracks for mixing, or whether it's the final masters. So if you like what I'm talking about here, there is a link in the description below for you to start using the Project Organiser. And best of all, it is completely free and it will work on any device that you are using right now. So go ahead and click that link and ensure that you never forget or lose a great song idea again.